Have you ever actually wondered why these massive, super well-intentioned moral movements just seem to collapse under their own weight? Meanwhile, smaller, maybe less ethical forces just slice right through them. It is wild, right? Well, welcome to today's Explainer. We're going to unpack this really fascinating framework that completely flips the script on what it means to be an active force for good in the world. We aren't talking about morality as some soft, passive ideal here. No, we're looking at it as a rigorous, structural force. So let's just dive right into how good actually operates, how it survives, and ultimately how it wins.
Here's our roadmap for this explainer. First, the vulnerability of good. Then, the omnivore's altruism. Third, abundance and moral sense. Fourth, the rules of hospitality. And finally, we'll wrap up with the two guards parable.
All right, let's jump straight into part one, the vulnerability of good. How exactly do these modern political and moral movements end up struggling against themselves? The source material sets up this fundamental political conflict in a really fascinating way. It gives us a completely neutral, structural look at why the left, or the egalitarian force, often struggles, even when it has way more numbers. The argument is basically that the egalitarian movement carries internal contradictions. It kind of argues with itself. On the flip side, the right, the anti-egalitarian force, operates more like a pattern-matching system. It doesn't win by having more people, it wins by being totally consistent, simply exploiting the contradictions of the larger group. To fix this, the framework suggests the egalitarian side literally has to converge. They need to pull together so tightly that any contradictory thought trapped inside becomes perfectly, glaringly obvious by contrast.
So what do you actually do once that opposing pattern is out in the open? Well, the author introduces this idea called the Jericho Protocol. Think about the biblical story of the walls of Jericho, right? Nobody is actually out there hitting the wall with a sledgehammer. Instead, the strategy is to just let a flawed, contradictory system exhaust its own capacity for action. You literally step back, let the structure deliver exactly what it promised, run its process all the way to completion, and just watch it collapse under the weight of its own flawed logic. You defeat the system simply by letting it run on empty until it just completely burns out.
And honestly, this brilliantly illustrates the ultimate takeaway of this whole structural approach. By letting a flawed system fail its own loop, you aren't just destroying it. You're converting its failure into a permanent lesson. The author points out something pretty profound. Across all of human history, the wars, the coups, the brutal realities of evolution, good actually prevails. We don't even need to argue that good wins, because our very existence, the fact that we are sitting here today analyzing this, is the surviving evidence of that track record. The failure of anti-egalitarian systems literally becomes the teaching material that lets egalitarian thought operate clearly without distortion.
Okay, moving right along to part two, the omnivore's altruism. Here, the framework shifts from these massive societal movements right down to you and me, the individual, and it completely challenges this very common but false binary.
We usually think of morality as this strict binary, right? Like, you're either completely selfless or you are completely selfish. But the source text dismantles this using a really brilliant dietary metaphor. It says the herbivore represents the pure altruist, but their fatal flaw is that they refuse to kill what actually needs killing. Then you have the carnivore, representing pure selfishness, refusing to harvest for anyone but themselves. But the true altruist? That's the omnivore. The omnivore resolves this whole false binary through selective consumption. They apply the correct force to the exact right target, harvesting what is good and cutting back what is bad, almost like a really careful gardener.
The absolutely crucial point here is that being an omnivore is not passive. No way. Unlike herbivores or carnivores whose diets are just strictly hardwired by biology, the omnivore has to actively perceive and make a choice every single time. It requires you to really use your eyes and ears to recognize what's in abundance. You have to constantly calibrate your force to serve the whole. The author notes that this freedom to choose and the heavy burden of actually making that choice, well, they're the exact same muscle. For you and me, doing good isn't just some state of being you achieve. It is an active, highly demanding, and continuous daily choice.
Let's shift gears a bit and move to part 3, abundance and moral sense. Let's see how all of this builds into our relationship with our environment, and specifically how the world around us impacts our internal moral compass.
I really want you to let this quote sink in for a second. Scarcity is not punishment, it is calibration. Wow. The source material argues that human beings inherently know good from bad. I mean, a starving person knows exactly what they need, right? But when we sit in long-term abundance, that moral sense dulls. It gets diverted. This actually explains why traditions like monastic vows, poverty oaths, or asceticism exist across so many different cultures. They deliberately remove surplus to keep the moral instrument sharp. Think of it like this. If a compass sits too close to a giant magnet, it can't read true north. The instrument only works correctly when it actually has a clear signal to read.
And this brings us to a super nuanced redefinition of that popular, often provocative slogan, "Eat the rich." Now, applying this framework, the author argues that the rich aren't inherently evil by nature. Actually, they are just deafened by condition. Their moral instrument is totally saturated by having too much abundance for too long. So, eating the rich in this specific philosophical context, it's completely stripped of any resentment or destruction. Instead, it's framed as an act of tending a garden, trimming back the overgrown, excess plant so the actual person underneath can be harvested. By removing that excess, you're simply restoring their capacity to hear the moral signal. You're restoring their ability to receive teaching.
All right, in part 4, the rules of hospitality, we're going to scale this solution right back up to the societal level, entering what the text beautifully calls the kingdom of good.
So how exactly do you manage entry into this kingdom of good? Well, the text presents this fascinating dynamic between a gate and a way. Membership is completely free, but it is strictly conditional. And here is the genius part. The condition itself acts as a self-defending filter. For someone who's already out there doing good, someone who views status as a literal obligation of service, the boundary is entirely frictionless. They don't even see a gate. To them, it's just the path they're already walking on. But for the privilege seeker, the person who just wants the crown without putting in the conduct, that exact same condition materializes as a massive, impassable gate.
The author roots this whole concept in Xenia, which is the ancient Greek guest law. If you remember reading Homer's Odyssey in school, the whole epic is essentially a ledger of who keeps Xenia and who breaks it. Under this law, a host has to blindly receive, feed, and protect a stranger, because for all they know, that stranger might be a king, a beggar, or literally a god in disguise. This law makes everyone royalty at the table. Entry to the kingdom of good is exactly like this. There's no toll, no interrogation, the door is just wide open. But, and this is a big but, your membership is instantly and conditionally held by your conduct. You either keep faith with the house that fed you, or you self-execute your own removal by abusing the welcome.
Which brings us to our final section, part 5, the two guards parable. This is where we really test this philosophy of hospitality against a classic, practical logic puzzle. I'm sure you probably know the riddle. You approach two guards, one always lies, one always tells the truth, and you have absolutely no idea which is which. You have to figure out the right door. Now, the standard solution is this clever, self-referential trick question, but the author points out a massive flaw with that standard answer. It actually rewards cunning and assumes your baseline posture in life is suspicion. It treats the whole world as just a puzzle to be beaten with trickery. Instead, the source material poses a much harder, way more interesting question. How do you beat the liar without a trick?
The answer is what the author calls the hospitable solution. First, you just simply greet them openly. You go first, acting entirely in good faith, and you offer your name. Now, the truth teller greets you back and names you correctly. But the liar? The liar completely fails their own constraint. Because lying is compulsory for them, they are structurally forbidden from actually getting your name right. You see, you don't have to engineer some clever trap. By simply declining to enter their game as a riddle, the liar's very own nature exposes them.
Let's break down the actual mechanics of why this works so well. A name is the exact point where identity and truth touch. It is purely, undeniably you. The liar cannot acknowledge you truly because genuine recognition is structurally impossible for them. Now, if you try to be clever and fake your name, well, the liar passes the test too, because you've just stepped right into their register. You've literally doubled the dishonesty. By simply acting in good faith, your honesty organically reveals their deception. Good faith itself becomes the ultimate unmediated filter.
And that brings us to the ultimate test of this entire framework. The condition for the kingdom of good isn't about being the smartest person in the room or fighting the hardest, most brutal battles. It is a convergence test of hospitality and active altruism. It really all comes down to this one profound question. Can you see the person in front of you truly and say back what they are? If you can actually operate in that kind of good faith, actively harvesting the good and cutting the bad, you just might find that the gate opens for you effortlessly. Thanks so much for joining me on this explainer, and I'll leave you to think on that final question.